Welcome to Garden Sanity. I'm Laura, and today I'm going to show you the results of a one-day landscaping project that turned out fabulous. And it has to do with all of these Emerald Green Arborvitaes, as well as some red-tip Photinia. No, I didn't do it, nor did my husband and I do it. We actually hired a landscaping team that we love. They banged it out in one day. And there's several reasons why we had them do this. It was more than just removing the yucky Leyland cypress trees. It had to do with amending the soil. It was a huge undertaking. We gave them a long list to do, and they banged it out in one day. 7 guys, 10 hours, done. We could have never done it. It would have been a all summer project. So in this video, first I'm going to give you some background as to what happened with the Leyland cypress trees we planted. Then I'm going to show you the results, and then finally tell you exactly how to care for your Emerald Green Arborvitaes. They're a popular tree to use in landscaping and as privacy hedges. So let's get started. So my husband and I planted these Leyland cypress trees back in 2010, just a few years after moving into this blank slate backyard. We wanted a nice green privacy fence in front of all that lovely white vinyl. And for many years, these grew nicely and they looked fine. But when we had Superstorm Sandy hit us, it caused several trees to uproot, and we sort of just kind of pushed them back into place. Then a few years later, we lost 2 of the trees in a tropical storm, and we had to have them removed by an arborist. So fast forward to last fall, and my husband and I decided we were officially done with these trees. They weren't looking great, and they actually started to take up more room than we had initially intended. Plus, the entire length just looked sloppy. The limbs stuck out, but were rather spindly. There were constant brown needles dropping. These trees weren't happy, and neither were we. So we loved the look of the Emerald Green Arborvitaes elsewhere in our landscaping. For example, we planted these back in 2009. It was one of our first back-breaking projects because this area was originally all woods, and let's just say the developers didn't do a great job removing the roots when they removed the trees. But we did it, and although these were only tiny 2 or 3 foot trees at the time we planted them, look at them today, 14 years later. Geez, time flies. So that's what we decided we wanted, another row of Emerald Green Arborvitaes that could serve not only as privacy over time, but also as a beautiful backdrop to our gardens. And yes, this opens up all kinds of ideas and things that could be planted in front of them, or in sections, who knows? But first, we weren't even sure if this would work in the soil, as it's a bit wet with heavy clay. Plus, when we hired different landscapers to put in edging back here, they added landscape fabric before adding the decorative rock we wanted, and that just made everything worse. Landscape fabric traps weed seeds and makes it harder to pull those weeds out. Plus, the fabric traps moisture, which is not needed when you already have heavy wet soil. So, first, we tried an experiment. 2 years ago, we amended the soil ourselves and planted 1 Emerald Green Arborvitae and 1 red-tip Photinia, just so we could see if they would do all right. 2 years later, we knew the experiment worked, as both trees looked great and were growing nicely. So, after seeing how well they did, we knew this was the way to go, but it was going to be a huge job because of the large amount of work involved. So why did we hire landscapers instead of doing it ourselves? Well, last summer, I showed you the makeover we did on this side bed around our patio. My husband and I removed all of the rock and the horrible landscape fabric, which I hate, and then we went to work amending the soil. And that was quite a job because we dug down very deep and we added in gypsum, and then we added in composted cow manure to improve the drainage and the soil nutrition. Only after that was all settled did we eventually plant wet-loving plants, because the area is still very wet, just not swampy anymore. And then we replaced all of the decorative rock. So it took us a long time to do this project in between everything else going on. I'll link to that video about it at the end so you can see what all was involved. It really did turn out great. So instead of doing all of this ourselves, which would have meant removing all of the Leyland cypress trees, removing the decorative rock, removing the landscape fabric, amending the soil, etc., 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 we decided, let's hire our favorite landscapers. And like I said, a team of 7 guys came out and banged this out in 10 hours in one day, and it looks fabulous. And I'll show you it in a minute. But first, let me read to you the marching orders we gave them. And I say that in a funny way. They're great guys. So to replace the Leyland cypresses, there were 9 of them, and we decided we'd keep the large one at the end because we love that tree. In fact, we're thinking that's kind of a mutant Leyland cypress because, as you see, it's grown way taller and it's way more lush than any of the spindly guys that we had. So they removed those trees, and then with the large one at the end, what they did was they trimmed up the branches off the ground so it looks much more tame is the best word I can describe it. It seemed like it was overgrown and taking over that corner. Now it looks nice and neat. I absolutely love it, and it's providing more space for us to garden back there. So that's a perfect result. So then after everything was removed, then they had to take the decorative rock off. Then they had to take the landscape fabric out, and that was embedded with roots, and oh, it was just awful. But they did it, and they saved the rock to put back in, cleaned it up a little bit and put that back in afterwards. So after everything was out and they were just left with soil, what we had them do was amend the garden soil. And what we told them was to dig deeply and mix in a lot of composted cow manure and additional garden soil, plus Espoma gypsum and Espoma plant tone to bring up the soil level. And the reason we did that is because arborvitaes, they like fertilizer, they don't need a lot of it, but we didn't want to fertilize around each plant, and we didn't want to put the gypsum in each hole. That's actually not a good idea. The best way to always plant arborvitaes or any of your shrubs and perennials is in your native soil. You can amend around the soil, but if you start amending the hole that they're going into, sometimes the roots get stuck in that little hole then because of the amendments, and they won't really spread out and be as healthy for you over time. So we had them amend all the soil, and that was a job. They dug down really deep where it's kind of wet all the time because this is heavy clay, and they added in all the gypsum. They ended up using 1 36-pound of gypsum, 1 36-pound bag of plant tone, as well as lots of composted cow manure and really good soil. After all of that was done, then they added back the decorative rock. Now, we didn't really have as much decorative rock as we wanted as it was, so they ended up bringing in another ton, which we knew that was a possibility. We budgeted for it, so there was another ton of this decorative rock that was brought in, and it's almost a perfect match to rock we have elsewhere in the other garden beds, especially around the patio. It's not perfect, but your eye thinks that it's a match, so that's all that's important. So they put in 2 red tip Photinias, then 1 Arborvitae, another red tip Photinia, and then here's the Arborvitae and the red tip Photinia we had already planted. And you can tell they're a little bit larger, older. They were planted 2 years ago. And then another red tip Photinia. And then we started the row of the rest of the Arborvitaes all the way down the line. So for comparison, these are the 2 red tip Photinias. Actually, there's a third one hiding back there that we have planted right next to our patio. And these started out as shrubs, and we let them grow into trees, and that's what we're doing with the red tip Photinias that were just planted last week. So you can see this one is putting out a lot of red, and this one is filled with flower buds. This is going to be covered in white flowers in probably another week or so. And then as soon as that's done, I am going to be out here with pruners, because look how far out this stretches. Let me show you this way. You see this? Look at this. It is stretching way far out and way up. So I will be giving this a good pruning. I will take my time, and I will have my husband hold the ladder. But across the way, this is what these guys look like. So this is the one we planted, as I mentioned, 2 years ago, along with this Arborvitae. And then the other red tip Photinias are smaller, but eventually we'll have them just keep growing into trees. And we won't be pulling out any stems. It'll be multi-trunk trees for all of them. So it'll look really nice. And then starts the whole long row of Arborvitaes all the way down to the large one on the end. And you can see our neighbors have a little playhouse back there, so eventually these will give them privacy and give us privacy. What's the saying? Fences always make good neighbors. Now, starting at this end, and again for comparison, here is what the Arborvitae looked like before they did the trimming, so you can get a good sense of how big and full it was. So what I had them do was, there was an extra stem growing out. I had them take that off the bottom, and then they limbed it up. And I'm still going to cut out some of these upper limbs that they left here, some of the dead stems. But look how much nicer it looks, backing up and hopefully not kill myself in the process. But just look how pretty that is. Now it doesn't take over this backyard space, yet it can still grow so well. And I mentioned this in a previous video. What's also nice is when we first moved back here, this forest was a little bit devastated. And now there are so many more trees growing. There was a cardinal that just went by. There's a robin. We have so many birds. I love it. And that's a cedar tree that's growing behind it. There's a couple cedar trees right there growing behind it now. And that's starting all throughout the behind the fence area of the backyard. So I'm so happy that we're going to have more evergreen trees back there. And then one thing they did do for us was they added a wooden shim, which I'm going to cover that up with a little bit more stone right at the back. And then eventually when the trees fill in, you're not going to see it anyway. But that just helps secure the fence a little bit more. So as these grow, they're not pushing on the fence. We could have never done this project ourselves. These are 6-foot arborvitaes that were planted, by the way. They were all burlapped, and they removed the burlap before they planted them. In fact, these trees were just dug from the nursery the day before, so they were really fresh, which means we lucked out that they should acclimate all the better since they weren't balled up for a while. And now, isn't it a much nicer backdrop when I show you things like the blooms that are kicking in on the prairie fire crabapple? I mean, I avoided showing this area. It was so bad. It was just awful. And now it just looks nice and neat, and it's just going to continue to grow that way and look lovely, and I'm thrilled. So now we come to how to care for your new Emerald Green Arborvitae. In general, these are low maintenance evergreens, and they're popular for hedges and privacy screens because of their growth rate. So they can grow 12 to 24 inches a year when they're young. Their mature height is between 10 to 15 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet wide. Now, the best time to plant your Emerald Green Arborvitaes is in the spring or in the fall. Now, early fall is actually the best time because your trees aren't going to have to deal with heat stress, and the same goes with shrubs or perennials. Fall is becoming a more popular time as people realize it's a better way to plant. No heat stress means that the roots can get established and get going, and you can have a nice healthy plant before the winter sets in. However, most nurseries and garden centers sell these in the springtime, so planting them in the spring is fine. Just avoid getting into the summertime. Summertime, you are going to deal with a lot more heat stress with these because they're very sensitive and they need a lot of water. Now, they're evergreen, and they will keep their color in the wintertime. It may not be as vibrant of a green as it is in the spring and summer, but it will stay green. There are times if you have a sudden drop in temperature, say sudden freeze comes in, that they will get a little bit of brown. And they can also get a little brown during the winter time if you have a lack of rain and snow. And so that's something to watch out for. If you start to see it browning and you realize you haven't had any rain or snow, it's a good idea to come out and water. Yes, even in the winter time, it's a good idea to water. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And most importantly, make sure your arborvitaes have good air circulation between them to prevent any fungal diseases. So planting them around 3 feet apart is best. You can go a bit under 3 feet if you want to, but usually 3 feet will do the trick and they'll grow in nicely. So these are hardy in zones 3 through 8, although elsewhere I've read as low as zone 2 and only up to zone 7. So the best idea is to check with your local garden nursery. If they sell them, they'll grow nicely for you. If they don't, there's most likely a reason, so just ask them. They're the experts for your particular growing area. Emerald Green Arborvitaes take full sun to partial sun. They need lots of sun in general, but in warmer climates, a bit of afternoon shade is fine. Full shade isn't good as the trees will not grow as full without a good amount of sun. During the first few seasons that your new arborvitaes are in the ground, they will need regular water, like I mentioned. And this is even more important when you're starting with a larger size like we are. When we first planted these arborvitaes back in 2009, although small, we had to water them all the time that first summer. At least that's what it felt like. And here's where soaker hoses can come in handy for this purpose. Now, we don't ever water these anymore, ever, not even during heat waves. I fertilize these in the spring with plant tone, and that's it. And yes, the best fertilizer is a slow-release organic fertilizer that will feed your soil over time. There's no need for anything more. So exactly how much water do your arborvitaes need? Well, when they're young, the first 2 years at least, they're going to need a lot. So if you're planting them in the spring, expect to water them at least twice a week for the first season. And you'll get to know as much as it might sound a little confusing, you'll get to know your arborvitaes over time. Usually the method is twice a week for the first, say, season, really. It's usually the first 2 or 3 months. So think of that as your summer season. And then weekly after that, at least for the first 2 years. What you can start to see is perhaps your tree, if it gets a little too much water, the little needles are going to start to turn yellow, especially on the ends. If you water it not enough, obviously it's going to start to turn brown. Now the other thing is you don't want to have soggy soil, so you don't want to waterlog these plants. They're not going to like that. Their roots are more shallow than deep, and so they'll get enough water when you water them. You don't have to, sit there with the hose forever and ever and ever. However, what a good idea is to mix in around the trees, mix in compost. And you can do this every couple years, every year. It's up to you how good or how bad your soil is. Again, really pay attention to your soil so you know what you're getting into before you even start planting. Now, in terms of mixing in compost, if you have heavy wet clay, you can mix in gypsum like we did. We dug down really low because that's where all the water tends to sit. It's not going to sit on the surface so much as it's going to sit down low. So the gypsum helps to break that up. And that's what you really want if you have heavy clay. If you have sand, it's a different story because your soil will drain very fast. So it's a good idea to get to know what kind of soil you have before you begin adding in amendments and whatnot. So besides adding in composted cow manure, you can also add in some mulch around it. And the best mulch, even though I'm using rock, the best mulch when you're trying to conserve moisture is to use wood chips or some sort of wood-based mulch. And anything that's going to cover the soil and conserve moisture is a good idea. Now for us, because this is already heavy and wet, I don't need to worry about things evaporating too quickly, and so that's why I can use rock. If I had very sandy soil, I would use a wood mulch, and I hope that helps. So are these deer resistant? No. Deer will eat them. Deer love them. In fact, there's many a sad story out there of deer eating these Emerald Green Arborvitaes, munching them right through to the center. Especially in the wintertime, if there's not enough food for deer, they will forage and they will eat these. It won't be as bad in the summer because deer usually find more things to eat, preferably not in your garden beds. So in the wintertime, what you could do is you could wrap them in burlap to try to prevent the deer from really getting at them. You can use deer fence. I know people that go out in the wintertime, as long as it's above freezing, the spray will work. If it's below freezing, that spray is not going to work that well. So it's up to you what you want to do, but just know that deer like them. In terms of covering them with burlap in some colder zones, that's actually a good idea for winter protection. And your best bet is to check with your local garden nursery. They're going to be the experts on how to care for these in the winter in your zone, especially if you're in a colder zone. So Emerald Green Arborvitaes are generally pest-free, but bagworms can be a problem, as can spider mites. Now I've not had to deal with either pest, but for bagworms what you're supposed to do is remove the egg bags as soon as you see them on the tree, and that's crucial. Then spray the tree with neem oil, which will kill the bagworm larvae. So the last thing I want to talk about is browning needles. And I'm not talking about the needles that are brown from underwatering them where they're stressed out from drought. I'm not talking about overwatering, because those times you'll see needles that are a little bit more yellow. What I'm talking about is a natural occurrence, and it's very similar to fall leaves. Now when you see fall trees, they have beautiful fall color, and then the leaves drop for the winter. Well, Arborvitaes and a lot of evergreens, both broadleafed and needle evergreens, will do this as well. Now, my red tip Photinias that I have, they primarily drop their old leaves in the spring, and they're evergreen, but those leaves drop, and they're dropping now, and they're everywhere. But once you clean them up, you're good. As for the Arborvitaes, they usually seem to do this in the fall, and you'll notice it because you'll see brown needles on the inside of the tree. And what's even better is I have a complete video that you can watch here next, so you can know exactly what it looks like, what to look for, and what to do. So watch that next, and until next time, happy gardening.